All right, listen up, RotoGrinders. It's the ownership report for Week 4, National Football League DFS here at RotoGrinders.com. My name is Chris Gimino, projector of ownership here at RG, and joining me to go over the Week 4 numbers is Dan Gaspar, Mr. Tuttle 05 on the daily fantasy sites. Dan, what's going on, man? Are you ready for a week of playing some of the grossest chalk on DraftKings that I've ever seen in my life, at least the cheap range? Are you ready to play Nick Westbrook Akini? I'm sorry, I can't even pronounce the name.
I hate the guy's name.
Pretty trashy guys, right? We're talking about here. I'm looking at some of these guys that are getting ownership, and it's pretty disturbing.
Yeah, no, I'm not ready to play any of these Titans receivers, really, and I don't think I will be. But we'll talk about that once we get to the wide receiver position, I guess.
And of course, I was going off the handle in Slack chat about Curtis Samuel being 3K on DraftKings, and then as it turns out, we don't really know for sure whether or not his role is going to be completely limited. If we knew his role wasn't going to be limited, we wouldn't be having a conversation about any of those Titans guys or anyone on the Giants or anyone really anywhere who was cheap enough, because he's their high-priced wide receiver. But of course, we don't have that information. We don't know, and we'll have to get to that when we get to the wide receiver position. For now, Tuttle, what we're going to need to do is talk about the quarterback position, where, as usual on DraftKings and across the industry, it's going to be pretty flat. People are tending to spread out their ownership these days, right? We're not seeing any sort of concentrated chalk at the quarterback position on any given week. I feel like I'm repeating myself. Josh Allen, even with a massive point spread and massive team total against the Houston Texans, is not projecting for more than 12, 13% ownership right now. And I think that's probably how it's going to shake out. Do you agree?
Yeah, 100% agree. And the thing is, which I don't think should be a thing, but people are going to be scared about blowout with Buffalo and Houston. Personally, I'm playing Josh Allen regardless. I do think the game will turn into a blowout, but I do think, if it does turn into a blowout, I think Allen gets his plenty. So I'm personally not worried about that, but that is something that typically drives down ownerships on these quarterback plays.
Yeah, and what's also interesting is that, throughout the season, Stephon Diggs hasn't been a big accumulator when it comes to the fantasy points that Josh Allen's been getting so far. So I think that his ownership, compared to the ownership that you might expect in this spot, will be a little bit suppressed. I'm not saying it's going to be low, but it's, he's not running away with the wide receiver ownership. I'll put it to you that way. Interesting spot here. Again, Josh Allen, one of the people that helped me have a decent week number 3 last week. Let's get into Dak Prescott here, who has had a couple of weeks that toned down, so to speak, from where we started the season with Tampa Bay. Now gets a matchup with Carolina, who has surprisingly good numbers in terms of some of their defensive metrics this season. Do you believe that Carolina is anything to be feared defensively, or are we looking at Dak Prescott at 6.7 on DraftKings as a potentially good option, let's say in an optimal lineup?
That's a tough question, because the way I want to phrase this is Dak is going to be the highest owned cash game option, I think, by a fairly wide margin on DraftKings. And I get it. He's been good. Dallas has been good. But we saw last week, this isn't what we saw in week 1 with Dallas, where they just throw the ball at every single snap or every single play. They are more balanced. They have been more balanced the last couple of weeks. I think Dak's a good play. And I think he's a fine cash game option, but if he is hitting double-digit ownership, I'm honestly not all that interested. I do think Carolina's defense is legit, and I don't think it's some amazing spot for him personally.
Yeah, so I'm not ready to declare that yet. I think that Carolina's defensive prowess remains to be seen. We're 3 weeks into the season, and we've had a matchup with the Jets included in some of these numbers. So I mean, we can't go overboard, saying that the Carolina is this or that in terms of their defensive prowess. However, I do think that there are definitely plenty of quarterback options to consider aside from Dak Prescott, to the point where I wouldn't get all of my exposure concentrated on this particular spot, even though he's a great double stack candidate, especially because you can throw a cheap tight end in the mix on DraftKings. That's more useful than on FanDuel or potentially on Yahoo. But if you are playing on DraftKings, getting that that double correlation in the big tournaments, forget even the big tournaments. Even if you're playing some of these 3-max tournaments, some double stacking and a bring back, and just getting that full game stack correlation tends to be what some of the winning lineups are doing. And I think that Dak Prescott has a potential to have a couple of good options there. Same is true with Josh Allen in terms of the number of different guys you can stack with him. And not as true, you will find this sort of a statement for someone like Jalen Hurts. Look, Kansas City stinks on defense, at least they have so far this season. And if Kansas City is able to put up offense, which they haven't been as prolific at doing so in 2021 as they've been in years past. However, this could be a very interesting spot here for the Philadelphia offense against the defense. Hasn't been able to stop anything. Why aren't we all getting excited about Jalen Hurts? I mean, granted, he's towards the top of ownership, but I mean, this is a spot for me where I'm looking at the Eagles as a potentially juicy option.
Yeah, and the thing is with Hurts is we basically saw like a worst case scenario for him last week, and he still ended up with 25.54 DK points, which is kind of why you play the guy. He didn't add a whole lot with rushing, but he got there at the end with a late touchdown and with his passing numbers. We mentioned it with Carolina how they've had a soft schedule to open up. Kansas City's kind of the opposite. They have played really tough teams offensively. So it's I don't think it's Kansas City's absolutely terrible on defense, but either way you slice it, it's still probably a good matchup for Jalen Hurts. And I really like if I'm playing Hurts, like you mentioned it, he's not necessarily like a guy you have to stack, but I do like Devontae Smith quite a bit on the field all the time. He should continue to get targets thrown his way. 6, 7, and 8 the first 3 weeks. But like I would not be surprised if we get a Devontae Smith blow up game sooner rather than later. So Smith is the guy that I'm stacking with Hurts, and I think it's a pretty decent tournament option this week.
Telling about how quarterback isn't necessarily correlated in terms of where you'll find the receivers ownerships these days. You got the John Travolta gift looking around the room, looking for the Eagles ownership after you find Jalen Hurts at the top here. No one's playing hardly any of these guys. And you mentioned Devontae Smith. No one's going to play Jalen Reagor. No one's going to play any of the tight ends. And sure as crap, no one's going to play Miles Sanders. All right, let's get into Patrick Mahomes, who has struggled. Mahomesian struggle. 24, 25 isn't exactly going to get you to the top of leaderboard when you're paying the kind of prices you're paying for Patrick Mahomes. But we got a matchup with the Eagles here. So we don't really necessarily know if the Eagles are a ceiling spot as far as 3 weeks into the season is concerned. But I will say that Mahomes can take any defense and turn it into a ceiling spot. And I'm not so sure that we shouldn't be double stacking him this week. What are you doing with Mahomes?
Yeah, it probably is a week where if we're looking at lower Kansas City ownership, you kind of just play the guys, right? I think the biggest concern would be we almost see something out of Philadelphia that we saw against Dallas, where they're just sit back in zone defense and just let them run all over them. Not that Kansas City is going to be jumping at the gun to do that with Clyde Edwards-Helaire, but they kind of did do it a little bit last week. Helaire got up to 100 yards. But yeah, I mean, the biggest issue for me here is the cost of the stack, and you mentioned it right away with how pricey Mahomes is. Tyreek Hill has been hidden. Kelsey is the guy that I would stack him with, but again, you're just looking at so much money being allocated to a stack, even with just those two. I'd like it, but I personally will not have a ton of KC builds, and I'll probably be regretting that.
One thing that you could probably do to be a little bit cute in the DFS OGs League, which you can sign up for by going to the front page of RotoGrinders and getting in there and trying to beat the crap out of Chop, Noto, Beer Makers Fan, all the other people from the RG community who are going to be playing in that particular contest, is you can go ahead and stack Patrick Mahomes, but this is on FanDuel, so Kelsey is going to be super popular on FanDuel. Maybe just stay away from him in the double stack and go for like a Tyreek Hill and a Mecole Hardman, and then you can get in there with some exposure to a high-powered offense like the Chiefs and don't get that ultra high. No, I'm not saying don't play Travis Kelce. I'm just saying, look, we're playing the DFS OGs League. Everyone's going to play Kelsey there. Go ahead and maybe get a little bit cuter here with a Kansas City stack in that one. Okay, let's get into the bust of last week, Justin Fields. 5,200 on DraftKings. You do not need to play him on other sites for the most part because you've got the salary relief at other positions where you're not necessitating a look at Justin Fields again. However, this matchup significantly better against the Detroit Lions. We can expect them to have a learning experience as far as how they're going to call the offense this week for Justin Fields. Maybe he won't be under duress 100% of the game again. Do you trust Justin Fields' title?
I trust the matchup. If he starts, I ultimately think he will end up starting. I trust the matchup more than anything. I do think it's a pretty decent. I mean, the ownership projections aren't showing it, but I think it's a pretty decent buy low spot for him and the Bears offense in general. And that's what's nice about Fields. We always mention he's got the rushing capability, so he's not somebody you have to stack with, but he's got options and low owned options that you can pair him with on this slate, and cheap options that you can pair him with on this slate. That I'm completely fine running Fields here.
Yep, that should be interesting to see how the field reacts. I'm not expecting that to get out of control ownership, and that goes for everyone at quarterback. Three other guys I just want to mention really quickly before we move on to the other positions. Matthew Stafford against Arizona is a player that should be seeing some additional popularity because of the success of that offense. You can especially expect to see some ownership on the wide receiver, Cooper Kupp. Now, also, Sam Darnold is an interesting option for me. You said you don't like so much the Dak Prescott side of this game. I really love the Sam Darnold side of this game, not just because Darnold has shown some improved ability to put up fantasy points this season in an improved offense, but also because I don't think that the backup Chuba is that much of a downgrade from the injured Christian McCaffrey. No, granted, it's a downgrade, but it's, as far as fantasy production is concerned, I think we're still going to see a similar operation here. And they have so many great wide receivers. They haven't even tapped into what Robbie Anderson can do yet this season. Terrace Marshall is a legitimate stud. And then the tight end position may have gotten an addition by subtraction by moving on from Darren Arnold. And now they'll get Tommy Tremble in the game, who is at the very least a good blocker and at most could be in addition to the offense. Bottom line, Darnold's got lots of great stacking partners that are not that expensive, and you can make a good lineup with him. Talk about him.
Yeah, I do think the interesting thing here is like Darnold, you're going to get a lot of DJ Moore. I believe we have him as the highest owned wide receiver on the site. Yes, we do. And like, so that he's the obvious stacking candidate. The thing is, though, I do like, and you alluded to it, without McCaffrey, it's not necessarily that I think Hubbard's good. It's more that McCaffrey's targets have to go somewhere, right? So Robbie Anderson, who has been non-existent to the start the season, he should see an uptick in targets. So yeah, he's a pretty easy double stack candidate. And the price for Darnold is kind of right where things drop off significantly. So I don't hate it. I am just curious on how many Darnold lineups will have the chalky DJ Moore in them, and if you want to double stack to differentiate or try to get a little different somehow.
I love DJ Moore as much as the next guy, but I promise you, if I use him in a 3-max tournament, probably not going to use DJ Moore with him. I mean, I just named 5 guys that I like. I don't love Tommy Tremble, but I mean, I could be just happy with Terrace Marshall and Robbie Anderson and call it a day, and just let hope that DJ Moore doesn't have another explosive outing. Last name I want to mention, Taylor Heineke against Atlanta. Atlanta's defense, obviously nothing to write home about. And we're talking about a player here who had a big game 2 weeks ago, not so much last week, and plenty of people to put around him as far as a double stack is concerned in these big tournaments. So Heineke, especially on some of these other sites aside from DraftKings, could be an interesting option. Are you interested in trying to roll the dice that we can get more of what we got 2 weeks ago instead of what we got last week?
Yeah, I'm cool with Heineke here. It's a pretty good spot. The biggest problem here would be like expecting Atlanta to try to keep pace and push the actually score the ball. Atlanta has looked terrible. Washington defense has obviously looked terrible so far this season. But I think it could kind of be a sneaky bounce back spot for the Washington defense, which is why I absolutely loved Antonio Gibson Washington defense correlation stacks on this slate. But Gibson, questionable heading into Sunday. I think he'll probably suit up, but he does have a shin injury. And you like Jarrett Patterson, I know, so you're looking for that to happen. But if Gibson is out, then I'll be more interested in Heineke. He's got mobility. He can run the ball. But if Gibson's in, I'm much more likely to have exposure to the rushing attack than I am passing attack, even though I don't hate the passing attack here with Heineke and McLaurin.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a little bit nervous about Gibson, but still considering him. I don't think the injury is that bad. It's not so much the injury as much as the fact that they'll use McKissick. I don't think they'll use Jarrett Patterson yet, but he's not completely worthless as an offensive player based on what we saw in the preseason from him. Hey, Tuttle, if you are looking to play a big studly player in DFS, Derrick Henry fits the mold. You can also play with guys like Derrick Henry on Thrive Fantasy because you are not looking at scrub-a-dubs like Jarrett Patterson, like Nick Westbrook, Akine over there. You're looking at the biggest and the baddest mofos of them all. You can go prop up on Thrive Fantasy this season. What is it? It's an esports and daily fantasy sports app that's done with props. So you can eliminate the countless hours of research, going for guys like Nick Westbrook, Akine, and go ahead and focus on the top athletes like Derrick Henry. Choose 10 of the top 20 available players to build your lineup. Each prop is going to be assigned a value for the over and the under based on how likely it is to hit. Hit the most props and rack up the most points to win your share of the prize pool. Use promo code GRINDERS when you sign up over there, and you'll receive 100% instant first deposit match up to $250 plus free entry into their featured contest for the week. Download Thrive Fantasy on the App Store or the Google Play Store or by visiting their website, thrivefantasy.com. Sign up and prop up today. Now, I mentioned Derrick Henry. What are you doing with this guy? He's going to be priced through the nose on all the sites. However, that's because they don't have any wide receivers. And quite frankly, the Jets are nothing to write home about on defense here. We're expecting a big game. Are you playing him?
Playing some of him. Got asked this question on the Swolecast earlier this week, and my answer is the same. Even now AJ Brown, Julio Jones have been announced out. The way you handle Derrick Henry is easy, right? You fade him when he's chalk, and you play him when he's not. That's when he got his ceiling game out of against Seahawks when he was 5% owned or whatever. He's absolutely chalky here. To be fair, he has shown more involvement in the passing game, which was something we were scared about last season. And part of the reason why you would fade him when he's chalk, because chalk running backs that don't have involvement as a pass catcher have more paths to fail if they don't score a touchdown. So I will concede that Henry at least has a little bit higher of a floor than what he has in seasons past if his passing work continues. And I guess I would say his passing game work should continue in this spot, right? They just don't have anybody to throw the ball to. So while I say that, I do still think in tournaments the play is to not play Derrick Henry. And that's really scary, and I hate doing it, but like I think that's the move. I would not be surprised if his ownership is higher than the 18.7% that we currently have projected.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason that his ownership isn't getting higher than what's on the board right now is simply because he's so expensive. Like it's just very difficult to get Derrick Henry into your lineup when he's costing $10,000 on FanDuel, $8,800 on DraftKings, and we're also trying to fit in a bunch of other guys into our lineup to make a complete build. So again, it's a situation for me where I'm with you. We said it 2 weeks ago. I'll say it again. I'd probably rather take Derrick Henry when he's low owned, even if the matchup and situation are as good as we're seeing this week. Now, David Montgomery, 5,800 on DraftKings. It's a weird statement that I'm not excited about the guy who's going to get the ball 30 times against a bad defense. And I am excited about the guy who is, well, he's something less than Derrick Henry. I'll put it to you that way. Are you interested in what's happening with David Montgomery as chalk? Because this is a guy at the end of last year who was really getting it down against opponents like the Lions.
Yeah, see, this was the one guy who I actually like. I was a little bit surprised at the ownership projection, and I'll be interested to see where things fall. I thought heading into the week he was going to be semi-sneaky, right? Damian Williams was not involved in the offense at all last week, and we thought Damian Williams, at least I thought Damian Williams was at least going to have the pass catching role. He's completely conceded that. Montgomery is back to almost the bell cow role we saw last year when Tariq Cohen was out. I'm not 100% confident that continues this week. But if that does continue this week, he's an awesome play for 5,800. So I guess I'm more disappointed than surprised in seeing that his ownership projection is this high. But I will be interested to see where he falls in the mix of himself, Hubbard, and even Mike Davis, who is Davis will be one of those players that just pops in projection systems on a weekly basis. But I don't know if the ownership, I think people are getting wise enough to just not play him. But I'll be interested to see how that shakes out this week.
I'm shaking my head because I'm still not believing that Cordell Patterson is worthy of a 50-50 split in the backfield. I'm not saying Mike Davis is something great. I do think Mike Davis is interesting this week, but I digress to say that I'll certainly take David Montgomery over both of those guys. And that's a situation where I might end up eating the chalk in at least one of my lineups. Now, let's talk about some of the other high-owned guys in bulk. Alvin Kamara, DeAndre Swift, Najee Harris. Let's start with Harris. Do you actually think he's going to be owned? Because I'm looking at some of these other options that are available and wondering to myself, despite the 14 targets last week, that he somehow slips down the board. Am I crazy for having the numbers spit out Harris in the top 5?
No. And now we got the news that Chase Claypool's out too, right? So we have that going for us. And people like traditionally Green Bay is an easy team to attack on the run or on the ground too. So I don't think this is crazy projection. People will 100% go back. It's so hard to look over 19 targets. Again, that's not going to happen on a weekly basis, but with Chase Claypool out, like why, who's to say he's not going to see close to double-digit targets again, which is very valuable. Agree with this projection. And I think he's an interesting play for sure. And I don't know how much of him I'll have, but Claypool being out shakes things up a little bit for me personally, probably more so than it will on the big level as a whole. Like, I don't think it's going to have a huge influence on ownership projections, but my exposure to Pittsburgh is certainly going to increase now that Chase Claypool's out.
Kevin King also ruled out with a concussion for what it's worth. I mean, we're not getting overly excited about an individual defensive player as far as the team's overall prospects of success are concerned. I would say that the Steelers are going to be very low owned other than Harris. So that's a spot where if you're looking to find something dastardly in the millionaire maker, maybe the Steelers could give you something of note. Okay, DeAndre Swift is a player who has clearly shown that he's going to be the guy that everyone thought he was going to be last year. He continues to be banged up. This week against the Chicago Bears, I would expect that he will be pretty popular again. Are you going to be able to eat this chalk now that we're talking about a high-owned DeAndre Swift?
Yeah, I like him too much. We do, like, you have to parse coach speak, but we do have some coach speak in his favor as well, that he's going to get more involved, even rushing the ball. So like you even give him a little bit higher of a rush share than what he's seen in the past. He's a good play. This is a Bears defense. It's not the same Bears defense as the past. I'm not expecting like the game to shoot out, but I would not be surprised if this was just like two bad teams get together. As long as Justin Fields starting at quarterback, it's like two bad teams get together and they sneakily throw up 60 combined points somehow. So yeah, I like Swift.
How is roster construction coming together this week for you? So if you're not going to play Derrick Henry personally, so what is it starting to shape up with? Let's say like in a main tournament lineup, right? Like, we're not all that thrilled about the cheap wide receivers. We're liking guys in the mid-range here with DeAndre Swift. Are you looking at like a mid-range build again? Like, how are you piecing together your favorite team of the week?
Yeah, 100%. It's mostly mid-tier for me. And we've already talked about a lot of these mid-tier running backs that are just good plays. David Montgomery, Antonio Gibson, I've mentioned before, and we'll have to get an ownership update on him. But even like going down the list, Jonathan Taylor, who's also questionable, but if he's active, draws a matchup against the Dolphins defense that has been shredded on the ground the last few weeks. So yeah, I love a lot of these, or not love, like a lot of these mid-tier running backs, and even mid-tier receiving, I think is completely fine too.
That makes me raise an eyebrow at some of these higher price backs like Kamara, who hasn't really seen the receiving workload this season, Cook, who has been out. Those guys are certainly interesting to me if I think we're going to see some real gravity, even on a guy like Clyde Edwards-Helaire, like Mike Davis, like Antonio Gibson. These guys are all in the top 10 of the ownership projections right now. Chuba, by the way, do you think people are going to play Chuba on DraftKings? I know on FanDuel you're definitely going to see him. But at 5.9, is there just too many good mid-tier options? Should we be lowering the ownership of Chuba?
No, I think people will play him. I will probably have an underweight stance on him at that price tag just because I mentioned all the other guys I like in the similar price range. I think he's a fine play, and I think he'll be owned. But I will personally have an underweight stance on him.
Cool. All right, let's get into the wide receiver position. I think that there is, we've established that we're going to try to go into the mid-range at running back in some of these tournament lineups that we're building this week. I think fits right into that conversation with who's going to be owned at wide receiver. DJ Moore, Amari Cooper, Deebo Samuel, to a lesser extent, Robert Woods, CeeDee Lamb, all near the top of ownership right now as far as the projections are concerned. Are you concerned that some of these guys are, approaching 20 in terms of their popularity, and their roster percentage could get a little bit out of hand, especially if we saw like what we saw last week where, Cooper Kupp spiked up to the 30% range?
Yeah, so I am a little bit, and this is kind of like I'm going to regret taking that stance I took on Derrick Henry. I'll probably regret taking the stance I'm going to take on DJ Moore, because he's been a target monster with McCaffrey in the lineup. And I'm usually not like an individual matchups type of thing either, but Trayvon Diggs has been good this year for the Cowboys. He is, I assume, going to get a lot of time on DJ Moore, which should open up things for Robbie Anderson and whatnot. So I am concerned when some of these receivers start hitting, the 20% ownership that aren't foolproof. But if it's like Devontae Adams that starts hitting 20% ownership, who cares? Smash the guy in. He's still an awesome play regardless.
I'm eyeing up CeeDee Lamb here because, if Cooper at 6K is going to get, maybe 5-6% more than Lamb at 6.7, maybe doesn't fit. I mean, it's still mid-tier, but we're not fitting it quite as well as 6K would. Like 6K just fits real nice in a lot of different builds. So I think CD could, he could be even a little bit lower than 12% here for this particular matchup. And I do love him as a player. Don't particularly think that if he's on the top of his game, that any matchup is worth even discussing as far as how good I think this guy really is. Okay, so Amari Cooper is the mid-range guy. The high-price guy, I think, is going to be Devontae Adams this week. Cooper Kupp also qualifies here, and the ownership is going to follow him because of recency bias for sure. I do think Adams is the better play, though. Let's talk about that. Why aren't people getting even more excited about Devontae Adams here with no other wide receivers really to speak of here in Green Bay? They were already thin, and we know what Aaron Rodgers does when this happens. They're going to get on the 1 yard line. He's going to score a touchdown.
Yeah, they feed Adams. And so that's the biggest stat that stuck out to me, or one of the bigger stats that stuck out to me when I started my research this week, is Adams is top 12 in wide receiver scoring. I'm not sure exactly where he falls, but of those 12, I think there's only one other person who has less than 10% of their fantasy scoring due to touchdowns, right? So he's doing a lot with just receptions and yardage. He's only scored 1 touchdown so far this season. And he's just the guy that he's going to continue to do all the work and with receiving yards and with receptions. And then if the touchdowns follow, he's an absolute smash, which makes construction on DraftKings specifically interesting, because I think a lot of the question marks will be like, hey, do I play Devontae Adams or Derrick Henry in the flex? And I personally slide with Devontae Adams there.
I don't want to hear about matchups. I don't want to hear about coaches trying to scheme to take the best player out. They've had years to try to figure this out with Adams and Rodgers, and they can't. So he'll the volume's going to be there. He's definitely a great play. Deebo Samuel, you can't really say anything close to that about. Samuel's been a guy who's had a great 2021 campaign. However, we're seeing Brandon Ayuk sneak up into the mix here. And as much as I love Deebo, like are we going to see, is this the new Deebo Samuel norm, or is it more like 10, 15 fantasy points that really we should be expecting for him to go forward? Are we really looking at a 17 fantasy point player? That's what the projections say. I don't think that's incorrect based on the usage so far. Is it correct based on projecting forward where that usage will sustain?
It's tough for me to figure this out with Deebo. I think the biggest issue with the offense in general is that they just want Jimmy G to be a game manager, right? And that's most likely what's going to happen on a weekly basis, which then limits volume for guys like Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel. Ayuk is back to running full route share. I think there's enough for one of these guys to have a spiked week, but I think on most weeks, or what's going to happen is it's going to be more evenly distributed, which is going to stop spike weeks from Deebo happening. So like I like Debo more so on FanDuel. His price tag was 6,900 there, I believe. I think he's like an okay play. I think there's room for a spiked week, but I don't think you should expect that.
Yeah, certainly nothing that I'm expecting, but it's an interesting question as we get a little bit deeper into the season to see whether or not some of these guys who had strong starts will be able to keep it going. Okay, so now we're getting into the the lower rungs here of the highest owned guys. I mentioned Nick Westbrook, Akeem. I'm going to butcher this name every single time. This guy is nothing to write home about. I'm concerned that Josh Reynolds is going to come into the mix here and become somebody that honestly is going to take the snaps and targets away from a guy like Nick Westbrook. And you've got someone like Anthony Firkser coming back from injury here. Are we really able to trust a $3,200 player just because he got snaps last week? Or is this a situation where we could be looking at some fool's gold here?
I think it's possibly fool's gold. The biggest issue here is it's so hard. Like they have to, assuming they throw the ball at all, it has to go somewhere, right? And he's certainly the leading candidate for that. But it's like it's so hard to envision him. Like, is 10 points within his range of outcomes? Certainly. Is he going to absolutely break the slate with some 20+ point performance? It's pretty unlikely. Ideal scenario here for Tennessee, they get out to a lead and they give Derrick Henry legitimately 30 carries. That's an ideal scenario for them, which is why the Henry fade is very, very scary. I don't love the play here. I understand the reasoning for it. I will not be surprised if it hits, but I don't love it personally.
Yeah, I'm skeptical. I'll say that right now. Some other guys that are in this range that I think could be interesting tournament plays: Calvin Ridley. I mentioned Stephon Diggs earlier. Terry McLaurin, always up for a big game, and I do think that someone like a Cortland Sutton or a Corey Davis. I have him at 8% now. I'm a little bit concerned that that's a little bit too high. So those are all guys that are towards the middle rungs of ownership that could have big games and won't carry a tremendous amount of ownership. We'll get into some really low owned guys a little bit later in the show. Anything else here at wide receiver title? Anyone that you're really getting excited about? Are you excited about Tyreek Hill? Like, tell me, who's the guy that we've talked about so far that's really getting you excited coming into week number 4?
The guy you briefly mentioned would be Diggs. I do think, again, blowouts typically tend to drown out or push ownership down on some of these guys a little bit. I think Buffalo's good enough to get the ball whoever they want to in this matchup. I don't think there's going to be resistance on any level anywhere. So Diggs under 10% ownership, I think is a very good play.
Yep. All right. Let's get into talking about some of these tight ends for this week. Let's talk about Travis Kelce, who on DraftKings won't be as highly owned as we are going to see with him on FanDuel. But the ownership, generally speaking, isn't really the concern here. It's more the price on DraftKings. We know he's going to be the highest probability player to absolutely smash on any given week. This matchup with the Eagles is particularly juicy from that regard. Should we be taking an overweight stance on Kelce?
Probably. I think on DraftKings, it makes a ton of sense to do so. Again, FanDuel, it's a completely different story. You can typically pay up for tight end pretty easily. And that's the story this week. But DraftKings, yeah. I don't think there are going to be very many lineups that pay 8,100 at the tight end position. If you're doing the whole like matchups thing and you prefer Kelce against his own coverage, that type of I think that's all in play. And the logic is there for him just to continue smashing.
Yeah, and it's going to be a situation where you're not going to find a ton of ownership. So very, very curious to see whether or not we end up all sorry that we didn't get overly aggressive and trying to pay up for that position. George Kittle does have the questionable tag, expected to play. He's the next in line for ownership at the tight end spot. I think the more interesting conversation is Will Dissly. 2.6 in this particular situation where they don't have as many tight ends. Colby Parkinson is really the other guy that's coming back from injury that you're worried about as far as taking away the tight end targets on this team. We always like to have a punt tight end on DraftKings. Are you interested in the slow, aging, injured at least he has an injury-prone history, Will Dissly, or are you kind of looking at this as a situation to fade yet again and hope that he doesn't own you?
I think he's a good play. I will be surprised if he comes in higher owned than Dalton Schultz. I think everyone's going to go on the Dalton Schultz bandwagon here. And I wrote up before last game that there's still really not much of a difference between Dalton Schultz and Blake Jarwin, right? Like Schultz has the game on his back, but from a playing time perspective, from a target perspective, there's not a huge difference. And I would just not rely on Schultz repeating last week. So I think Schultz will be one of the higher owned tight ends, which is what we have. I think he'll come in higher owned than Will Dissly. But in general, like if he does come in as chalk, I'd rather have Will Dissly, as much as it pains me to say that. It's not a fun play. And some of this does depend too on both wide receivers for the Seahawks are questionable. I believe both will suit up, but we haven't confirmed that yet. But if like one of Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf is out, who are they going to throw the ball to, right? Pete Carroll will probably run the ball a lot with Chris Carson, who we didn't really talk about. But yeah, I like Dissly. I would prefer taking an overweight stance on him as opposed to Dalton Schultz.
I think that, going down the list, I think I mentioned Ferkshire earlier. I think he's an interesting, cheaper guy at the tight end position that you could go to. Evan Ingram, is he ever going to catch the damn ball, Tuttle? Like, Evan Ingram's a guy who certainly has the athletic prowess to have a big game. They're in the former course field of DFS. What is it now, by the way? Now that Drew Brees isn't around, what field is this? Is this the Petco Park of DFS? Like, I think things have changed down there in New Orleans, but can Evan Ingram have a big game here?
Yeah, it's fair to say things have changed, especially if you look at how much they've reined in Winston to start the season in terms of his passing attempts. I don't think he's top 23 this season or something like that. But yeah, I do think Ingram's an interesting play. It's kind of similar to like if the Seattle guys go down, who are they going to throw to the ball? Well, we know 2 Giants guys are down. Who are they going to throw the ball to? So Ingram for 3K is a very good play. They're going to be playing Colin Johnson a lot, I think it is, and Kadarius Toney. So yeah, I think Ingram's a good play, and I would not be surprised if he led the team in targets personally.
Yeah, it's certainly a situation that I'm looking to consider for my lineups here. Rounding out some of the top-owned tight ends, you'll see Noah Fant, maybe Kyle Pitts getting up towards that range. But, I do think that, looking at the top here, Dissly is going to be the top-owned cheap guy. Kelsey going to be the high-owned expensive guy. And let's get into the defense now. Look, the Lions are not particularly good on defense, but they are 2,200. I'm expecting them to be the highest owned defense. Are you expecting the same?
I think so, but it's also not like some of the past weeks we've had already this season. Like week 1 was the Falcons were pretty clearly, Bengals last week were pretty clearly going to be high owned. I don't think that's necessarily the case this week with the Lions. So I'm interested though. Like the alternatives in this price range, typically people like to save at the position, right? And there's just not a lot of good alternatives. So I do think they'll be the highest owned low price team. I don't know if they'll come out as like screaming chalk. I'm curious if people will take more of a build with some of these 3K defenses or not. But if you think the Lions are going to be 17% owned or even 10+% owned, really, they're a good fade in tournaments for sure.
Yep, I do think they'll be that owned. I think you'll see, for the same reason, the Falcons and the Cowboys and the Jets and, the Colts maybe could be a little bit owned. I think 6% is probably a little bit high. The same with the Seahawks here. But I think almost all the top defenses are going to be in the higher rungs of, the lower price points of salary here in week number 4. That's going to leave teams like the Packers, teams like the Bills, teams like the Washington football team, all low owned. And I think those are some of probably the better tournament defenses, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I mentioned again, Washington football team with Gibson. Even though they've been absolutely terrible this season, I think it's a sneaky good spot for them.
Okay, let's get into the low owned selection segment title. Each week, we're going to go ahead and try to find some of the guys who are at the lower rungs of projected ownership to find some differentiation in some of our lineups. As a reminder, you can go over to RG Premium and see all the ownership for 40 plus slates here this weekend on all the sites, not just on DraftKings, which we focused on primarily so far, but we've got ownerships for FanDuel, we've got ownerships for Yahoo, and we've certainly got ownerships for all these showdown slates and things of that nature. So go ahead and get over there to RG Premium, sign up and check us out. You also might want to like and subscribe to these channels, the YouTube channel or the RG Fantasy Football podcast feed. Both of those places you're going to find some great information week in and week out. And I highly encourage you to go ahead and smash the like and the subscribe on those channels. Okay. At the quarterback position, if you're going below 5%, where are you going to try to head in week number 4?
Yeah, so quarterback's actually pretty interesting to me. I mentioned already, like, if Dax can be extreme chalk, I don't really want to go there. And there are some names where if you just sort by the projected ownership column that stick out as like Kyler Murray, who's under 5%, Matt Stafford, Russell Wilson, all these guys I think are going to be low owned and are good options. The one guy I wrote down, well, I have a couple of guys. Baker Mayfield, I think is interesting. He's only he's not going to get a ton of attempts. He's been good from an efficiency standpoint so far this season. So I think Cleveland's going to score points on this Minnesota defense. It's just a matter of how they do it. So he stood out. And then Aaron Rodgers was the other guy. We mentioned Devontae Adams is going to be high owned. The other pass catchers, though, it'll be interesting to see, like, if people try to say, hey, MVS is out, let's own some of these other guys. I don't think they will, which likes me pairing Aaron Rodgers with Devontae Adams, and then even Robert Tonyan is like a really low owned double stack. Tonyan does not need the volume, so it's not like he's taking too much away from Devontae Adams if he just scores a couple touchdowns. I still expect Devontae to get there. So I do like Aaron Rodgers as a double stack candidate with Adams and Tonyan.
Yeah, and I was going to mention another couple of stud quarterbacks. If you didn't mention Rodgers, Russell Wilson is not going to be 5% owned, I don't believe. And Seattle is going to be without Josh Norman. Now, not that Josh Norman was any good, but they're getting ridiculously thin there in the secondary, are the 49ers. So you can go ahead and maybe take a look at what's going on with Russell Wilson in this spot. And I think Kyler Murray won't be particularly highly owned. I know the Rams are a tough defensive out, but when you've got the kind of dual skills that Kyler Murray has, if this turns into any kind of a shootout, he could be somebody that you could get stacked up there to get to the 30-point mark without a ton of popularity. Okay, running back position. Anybody of interest to you there?
Yeah, let me see. Oh, we actually, when we were talking earlier, you said nobody is going to own this guy. Yep. And I agree. Nobody will. Miles Sanders. We were talking about Philadelphia offense a little bit. So as a person who was overweight on Kenneth Gainwell last week, I can confidently tell you a lot of his snaps came last possession of the game and kind of in blowout run. I was very surprised to see Sanders on the field as often as he was. They obviously only didn't give him the ball a whole lot, only carried it twice. But he was involved as a pass catcher. He ran a route on 27 of 52 dropbacks, which is much more than I would expect out of him. It is a good matchup in terms of running the ball. The Chiefs are allowing 5.1 yards per carry so far this season. If Philadelphia decides they want to run the ball, they should be able to get it going a little bit. And considering he can potentially get 100 yards on the ground, and add that with the involvement I saw as a pass in the passing game last week, I do like him quite a bit.
Yep, he was definitely on my list here under the 5% mark. I think Chase Edmonds is interesting, going right along with the Kyler Murray pick, either in the same lineup as Kyler, because that would follow the line of they're behind and trying to catch up, and they're certainly looking to put their pass catching back in there in that situation, or just quite frankly by himself in a situation where the Rams aren't that, but James, this isn't a great James Conner spot total. So yep. Edmonds has not found the end zone just yet, but has had plenty of usage, particularly in the passing game. And, there's a chance he could be the goal line back, it's I would call it a coin flip in that regard. But there's definitely more outs at 5,500 for Chase Edmonds than the ownership is going to imply. Anybody else here at the running back position that is catching your eye, or should we be talking about some of these very deep, low-owned wide receivers?
Yeah, let's talk receivers.
Well, give me the best one. Give me the winner.
So Robbie Anderson is the guy that I've been touting since the beginning of the week, which is an uncomfortable tout because he has like 11 targets throughout the first 3 games. Already mentioned why I would expect that to increase. We got coach speak going in his favor. We got Trayvon Diggs on DJ Moore. We've got Christian McCaffrey's targets having to go somewhere. So I do think this is a pretty good spot for Robbie Anderson. I don't think he's going to be like super, super sneaky. These Pittsburgh receivers are where I'll be interested in now. I mentioned I do like Rodgers double stack. I don't like the game environment as a whole, but I just like where, like, if this was going to be a paced up game, I feel like we would love this, right? Because we have concentrated targets on both sides of the ball. Now that Chase Claypool's out, we know where the targets are going in Green Bay. We know where the targets are going to go to Deontay Johnson, to Najee Harris in Pittsburgh. So Deontay Johnson is the guy that I like quite a bit for Pittsburgh as well. And then Allen Robinson was somebody else I had written down. It will be interesting. Like, people want to quit on this Chicago team completely. I get it. I understand it. It really is a good matchup. Like, if Justin Fields, actually whoever's under quarterback under center for the Bears this week, I still like Allen Robinson. He's cheap. We know what he can do. He should command a decent share of the team's targets, and we just got to hope that it pays off, basically.
Yeah, I'm liking a lot of these selections here. Definitely going to be able to get these guys lower than the 5% mark, or at least somewhere very, very close to it if they somehow creep up unexpectedly. I think Tyler Lockett's going to be low owned this week, and I don't think DK Metcalf's going to be particularly high owned either. And I think that those two guys, in either alone or in combination, could be players that you're looking at getting with huge upside without a lot of ownership. I think that if you are playing somebody like a Jalen Hurts, you're not going to find Devontae Smith highly owned. You're not going to find Jalen Reagor highly owned. And I think that those are really interesting stacking partners with one of the better quarterbacks on the slate, who doesn't necessarily have to get all of his production with his legs, which seems to be the implication based on the usage as compared to the ownership. And finally, I do want to mention that Michael Pittman Jr., as gross as it sounds, has been getting a massive target share this season. Clearly the number one option, as far as I can tell, for the Colts when healthy. The matchup, not particularly fantastic with, if he ends up on one of those better secondary players. But I think the way that they'll use him, it's not as scary. He's not your typical type of guy that you're going to see followed around the formation. And I am expecting that if you're going to give this guy a 26% target share at 2% owned, that one of these weeks he'll end up going off without anybody on him. At the tight end position, Tuttle, did any of these guys stand out to you below the 6-7% mark that really make you want to go overweight the field?
Yeah, so we do have not terrible options down here. I'm not overly confident. I mentioned Tunyon a little bit as my part of the double stack. If you do not double stack him, he really does add some touchdown equity. He's very, very touchdown dependent, which is why I never play the guy. But if targets open up, if he scores the touchdowns for the Packers, if you get 15 out of him at his price tag, I think completely in play for tournaments. And I hate touting Bears, but Cole Kmet, another guy. Lions, again, just a good matchup in general, but they've been especially leaky to the tight end position, allowing 15.3 yards per target to the position. And Kmet, he's cheap. It's the Bears. They're terrible, but it's a crappy matchup that could have points in it.
I'm a little bit surprised at how infrequently the Eagles are targeting the tight end right now, but I'm just going to go back to the well one more time if I'm in that Eagles universe and mention that Dallas Goedert really hasn't yet gone into the mode where he's seen a huge target share as compared to where some people might have expected him to be. I mean, we're talking about 5 or fewer targets in every one of these games. Is this a guy who can get more than 5 targets in a game? Absolutely, by my calculations. And there's a situation where if he does that at 1.7% ownership, you're not necessarily going to find yourself saving enough money as compared to some of these cheap guys, but it'll certainly save off some of the top guys like your Kelseys and your Kittles. And I think if you are going to spend up and looking for another pivot off the expensive guys, Hawkinson is a player who can get, 7, 8, 9 targets, something like that. Certainly can get in the end zone, and he'll be low owned. As far as Higbee's concerned, I don't know what to do with this guy. Are you getting excited about Tyler Higbee? I want to, I want to do it, especially under 5%, but savings aren't there, and we're just not seeing the numbers. What are you doing with Higbee?
Yeah, savings not there. If he's on the field a lot, I definitely prefer. I liked using him last week as leverage. You're just not getting that as much this week. We still have Woods. I think Woods will be fairly popular. It'll be interesting to see where Kupp comes in. I know we have him projected pretty high, but in general, I don't think the Rams will be necessarily his own. So Higbee at 4.6, it's okay. Honestly, it's a fairly similar play to Robert Tonyan, who I already touted. It's just not going to be a ton of volume, probably only getting there if he gets a touchdown. So it's fine, but not a guy I'll have a lot of.
All right, folks, that is going to do it for the ownership report here in week number 4. We gave you a review of some of the top owned guys on the slate. We gave you a couple of picks below 5% that you may be able to use in some of these deeper field tournaments. Best of luck in all of your contests. For Dan Gaspar, I'm Chris Gimino. We'll be back again in week number 5, and go win something.